be alive in this land of ours. Good to drive in this land of ours.
Hello, Canada hockey fans in the United States.
The Hockey Time Machine.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hockey Time Machine. I'm Glenn Dreyfus. Tonight's guest, Steve Simmons, estimates he's written more than 8,000 columns for the Toronto Sun, Calgary Herald, Calgary Sun, and Post Media papers, and he estimates close to 7 million words. Let's talk about a different type of violence in hockey, fighting. You wrote this about Ty Domi. Quote, "There's always been a certain double standard in the job description of an NHL enforcer. Be tough, but not too tough. Be mean, but not too mean. Be dirty, but not too dirty." Is the enforcer now going the way of the dodo?
Already has. That guy doesn't exist anymore. The Bob Probert, Ty Domi, Dave Brown, however you want to, Dave Semenko, the guy who was there to police what was going on the ice doesn't really exist anymore. There are still fights. There are still, things that happen physically on the ice. But that guy whose primary role was, who am I going to fight tonight? And how is this going to work? And all of that, comes from a different era. And I think the piece that you're quoting from is the piece when Ty Domi, I don't know if it was sucker punched or got with his stick, Scott Niedermayer at the end of a playoff game with the Jersey Devils. And it got him suspended for the rest of the playoffs that year. And at the time, it was terribly disappointing for the Leafs because at the time they were playing great hockey. And at the time, the New Jersey game that night was just about their best game of that series. And they never quite recovered from all the brouhaha that came of the Domi incident and of the suspension. In this, before he knows that they've lost the series, he's already saying, like, I've let my team down and I'm so sorry for what I did. And that was part of understanding who they were in that role and how far they could go. And it's not even just how far you can go, it's when can you do it? Can you do it in game 35 in Philadelphia, or do you not do it in game 85, playoff round in New Jersey? I think, and this game was in Toronto, so it's a different circumstance. But I think that guy and that ilk of player is gone, and probably hockey is better for it that it's happened that way.
Because I read you calling out a hypocrisy in how violence was viewed, and this kind of violence is okay and part of the code, and this type of violence isn't.
Well, you know what? That's always been the way. You could go so far, but you can't cross. And the smarter guys knew how, and Domi was one of the smarter guys, knew how to do it without crossing the line. That time and a few other times in his career, he did. But if you think, I think he's got the second most fights in NHL history. If you think about it from that point of view, he picked his spots reasonably well, and he fought when he needed to fight, and when he believed he needed to fight, because sometimes it's an instinctual thing. And the coach didn't often have to tell that guy what he was there for. When he put you out in certain circumstances against certain players, you knew what you were there for. You don't have to. You don't need to get a little piece of paper that tells you, please fight now in the third period. When you had a lead, you didn't tend to fight. That was, rules that people put in. And in Ty's case, I think he was absolutely what you're talking about. He was enough of a hockey player that he could have played without fighting. Like he was a good enough skater. He was a good enough forechecker. He could have been a fourth liner on any team. But
and as you point out in the piece,
his value got greater because he could do the other things, because he could fight, and because he could protect, and because players played.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I kept thinking you were done and you weren't. But you also point out, and this is important, Domi, like a lot of these enforcers off the ice, were good guys.
Well, that's been the history of the fighter. I covered the NHL as a beat in the 80s. And if you want to walk into a dressing room and you want to talk to the best guy on the team to interview, 8 out of 10 times, it was the guy that fought. In Edmonton, it was Marty McSorley or Dave Semenko. In Toronto, for a long time, it was Domi. You could go team to team to team. Rob Ray in Buffalo. And so that kind of guy, there was just something about them. And they lived not an easy life, very challenging life. And I learned more about it as the years have gone on about, say you're in Detroit that night and you have to fight Probert. And, what was your afternoon nap like that day? And what was your night sleep like the night before? And how did you attack, to try and take on this giant of a man who was considered by most people, if not the best fighter of all time, the best fighter of his era. And so in Ty's case, Ty was never a big man the way Domi was, or the way Brown was, or some of those other guys who fought. He was pretty small and stocky and wide, but he took them all on, and wound up, as I said, with the second most fights in hockey history.
Another of the rare interviews you scored, Frank Mahovlich, you wrote, whatever happened between Punch Imlach and Mahovlich has left significant scars on the Big M. You talked to him after he retired. To the best of your understanding, what did happen? And kind of a follow-up question, why is Mahovlich, as you say, sometimes forgotten, even though he was a superstar?
Well, start with, I don't think he wants to be very public about, his life in hockey and when he played and after he played. He was a phenomenal player. In the 60s and early 70s, the best left winger in hockey was Bobby Hull, and the second best left winger in hockey was Frank Mahovlich. And there may be no one in today's game playing the wing who had as much talent, size, strength, shot as Mahovlich had. And so he had all of this. For some reason, Punch Imlach went at him. He would intentionally mispronounce his name. He would call him Mahalovich. And that really bothered Frank. And what came to be known over time, and Frank talks about it a little more openly now, is he had some problems. He had, everyone's talking today about, mental health and dealing with the issues of being a star and how difficult that can be. Frank had many of those issues. And in those days, nobody really knew what they were. So, people just, he's soft, he's this, Imlach just dismissed it and made it worse for him. And so as time went on, life with the Leafs became more and more miserable for Frank Mahovlich. He won 4 cups in Toronto. And I asked him about, because I was curious when I was having the conversation with him, I asked him about the last cup, which, everyone talks about 1967. That's the mantra now around here. And he said it was probably his least favorite year in hockey. And whoever says that about winning a championship, That's how much he disliked punch, and that's how much he wanted to get away. And the next year he did. They traded him 1 year later. But when you listen to Frank talk, he's an eloquent, spoken man. He's been in the Senate. He's a smart guy. But he wanted nothing to do with the way the NHL was, with how they treated players, with how, in particular, Punch Imlach treated players, and really, he didn't speak about it for a very long time. I happened to call him out of the blue when the Leafs were playing Montreal in the playoffs 2 years back. I thought, who better to talk about the Leafs and the Canadiens than someone who, starred for both teams. He was a great Maple Leaf, and he still has the record, I believe, for most points in a playoff series or a playoff season for the Montreal Canadiens. You think of, they had Lafleur, they had Beliveau, they had, Richard, they had all of these amazing players, and there's Frank with the record for most playoff points in a season. And he opened up greatly, and I wrote the piece. And you really take, a time when you do something like this because you want to get it right. And I didn't think anything other than you filed it and you were happy with it, and they put it on front page of the paper, which always is a sign that they liked it too. The next morning, my phone rang. It was Frank Mahovlich calling. I just wanted to thank you. My phone hasn't stopped ringing today. The amount of love I'm getting from old friends and from people. And then he called me a second time just to say, this was great. Thank you for writing this. And to be honest, in a career of 40, I don't know how many years now, you don't get that call very often. And often it's not from that player. It might be from an agent, or it might be from a parent or a sister or a brother. But to have one of the all-time greats get on the phone and call you at home, that was touching for me.
Well done. About Don Cherry, you wrote, the loudest speaking, loudest dressing Canadian couldn't be any more the opposite of his loquacious television persona. Now, what I took away from the column may not be what you wanted me to take away from the column, which was, well, you pull back the curtain on the bombastic, great, and powerful Oz, and there's a sad, lonely old man.
I didn't find him sad or lonely. I found him singular, and I found him to be very, very introverted. And so here we would see Don Cherry on Saturday night and Hockey Night in Canada, and he was yelling at us, and he was, look here, kids, and he was lecturing, and he wore the suits and the crazy clothing. And so what you saw on television, it's no different than really an actor playing a role. When you often, you hear afterwards that this actor or that actor, is very introverted and doesn't like to go out and be seen. So what gave me the idea for this piece, we're in Las Vegas, and it's the Stanley Cup final is in Las Vegas. It's the first year the Knights are playing. And there's Don Cherry sitting in the stands at practice with Ron McLean. And I wandered over to where they're sitting. I said, do you mind if I stay for a few minutes? And so we stayed for a few minutes, which turned into more minutes. And I just talked about, here you are in the entertainment capital of the world. What does Canada's most famous man do? Like, where are you in the casinos? Are you out in the great restaurants? Are you at shows? He says, I don't leave my room. I said, what do you mean you don't leave your? I don't leave my room. Then he went into the whole routine of what he did every day and what he ate. And he used to bring his own sandwiches made by his wife on the road with him. So he would eat these, 2-day-old salmon sandwiches rather than order room service or anything else. He would watch baseball at night because he loved baseball. And Ron McLean would, at a certain time of night, would come every single night to his room to have a beer. And he had this routine. And I thought, as I'm listening to this, that I've never seen this written anywhere before. I've never read it anywhere before. I'm going to write this. And I was really pleased that I did write it, because it told a story of at that time, one of the most famous Canadians, still maybe one of the most famous Canadians, and things nobody knew about him, and how he doesn't leave once he doesn't go out for dinner to restaurants, and he doesn't, get out there, and he's not out in the rinks, being seen. He's pretty quiet until he puts that suit on and it's time to do the show. And then the light comes on and he's a star.
I agree with your assessment that it's an act and he's an actor. The difference for me is with an actor, it's fiction and that he's playing a character, and someone who builds a reputation as being the ultimate truth teller, for me, should be more what you see is what you get.
I don't look at it that way necessarily. I think I'll use my cousin as an example. I have a cousin who's a reasonably well-known Canadian singer, and he's had a great deal of success. And when he's on stage, he is the most outgoing entertainer, almost wild in how he approaches it, and he's terrific. When you see him at home or at a family event or anything else, he's the quietest, shyest member of our family. And is he being phony? No. He's doing his job the way he needs to do his job. And when he's not doing his job, he's being himself the way he needs to be himself. And in Cherry's case, I don't think, I think he just became who he was, and he was happy to settle into that and do all of his entertaining and everything else when those 3 minutes came on and the lights came on Hockey Night in Canada.
You got Derek Sanderson to make a remarkable self-assessment, I thought. Sanderson saying his life was a, quote, total ad lib, which can be fun, I suppose, for a while, but also a scary way to live.
Derek Sanderson's one of my favorite interview subjects, because if you're old enough to remember him as a player, he was kind of a celebrity, popular figure in the 70s, late 60s, but he was never a great player. He was never like a big star, but he was a hugely popular guy. And his life fell apart. Like, he made a ton of money, then he lost a ton of money, then he lost himself, then he lost a battle with booze, then he at one time, I believe, was homeless, and he went through the whole gamut of being, I remember Bobby Hull saying the best way to lose $1 million is to start with two. And I think in Derek Sanderson's case, that was kind of what happened, except he lost all of it and then wound up kind of on the streets of Niagara Falls, and then came back to a point where he got back to Boston and wound up getting into the stockbroking business, and then back on television as a color commentator. It was a phenomenal story of a life and then some, and some great moments and some things you wouldn't wish on anyone. And he saw all of that, and he lived all of that, and and one thing he never understood or cared to understand was that people thought he was a star, and so people looked at him like he was a star, and he never thought of himself as being a star, and he never thought of himself being that great of a player. But when the WHA came in, he got a huge contract to go there, and it's just. As he points out in the piece, and I think it's been done as a documentary, although I'm not entirely sure. Somebody should make this as a movie. I think it'd be a terrific movie.
The WHA money, if that's not the first thing that people remember about Derek Sanderson, it's right up there. And yet you got this very insightful quote from him. He says to you, "The WHA money wrecked me."
And here's what happened. It's not just him. We've seen this. We're still seeing it today. Some athletes can't handle going from $18 team meal money or whatever it is when you're playing junior hockey or college basketball or wherever it is you're getting your few dollars from. And then all of a sudden you have enough money for the rest of your life and you don't know what to do. You don't know how to handle it. There's no course that teaches you what you're supposed to do. And sometimes you have the wrong agents. Sometimes your agents steal from you. And so some people aren't ready to hit it rich. And so we've seen case after case of this happening. And, you know, not just in hockey, in every professional sport where, you know, the guy hits it big and then he can't deal with having, you know, the money. I think it happened to Mike Tyson in a different kind of way. He hit it big financially. And then, you know, 1 year later, there's 11 cars in his driveway. It just, not everybody makes sense of their lives in those kind of circumstances. And again, as I said with Sanderson, I would love to see somebody ambitious, you know, maybe Netflix Canada, somebody ambitious go out and make the Derek Sanderson story.
A pair of solo columns of yours that I want to group together about a pair of fascinating and deeply flawed leaders of the Players Association. You mentioned the NHLPA earlier. You wrote both about Alan Eagleson and Bob Goodnow. About Eagleson in particular, you wrote, so strong, so bright, so dynamic, so twisted, so full of himself, defeated first by his own ambitions and later by the law. How do you explain it all, Steve?
Well, I think what happened with Alan Eagleson was what is that line about power and absolute power corrupts? I think he got into a position where he thought he could do anything. And he thought that, you know, he could be the representative of the players, the representative of the owners, the representative of the television networks, the representative of everything. And so over time, you know, what happens is when you start doing things and you get away with it, and you start doing some more things and you get away with it, and you start doing some more things and you get away with it, and then suddenly you're getting caught. And that's what happened with Eagle. You know, he got caught and he did things that, you know, frankly are despicable. And so, you know, I wrote the piece that I wrote about, which I believe was written from court on the day he was found guilty or pled guilty, you know, to the charges against him. And again, I got to know Alan when I started covering hockey in 1980, and he used to come out to Alberta a few times a year, and he was always so effervescent with the press and with the players and everybody else. He was kind of a whirling dervish kind of a guy. You couldn't help but like him when you first met him, and you couldn't help but be impressed by him. And so you can understand how he got to where he got to. It's harder to understand, you know, how and why everything went wrong for him. It's a little different in the case of Bob Goodnow. I don't know if you want to intro off of that or let me
I will
go
only say this. You called Goodnow's Players Association, quote, an organization without a soul.
Well, players in today's NHL and players for maybe the last 10 years or more should be thankful to Bob Goodnow for how much money they have been paid. That's the one thing he did for players that you can say was great. What he didn't do for players was be honest and upfront. I'll give you an example. The NHL lost a year, an entire season, because Bob Goodnow had convinced the players that he was going to fight against the salary cap coming in and that he could win. And he fought and he fought and he fought, and there was no win. There was no way they were going to win. And he went down swinging to the end where he never once turned to anyone and said, I'm sorry, I just cost you $5 million or $3 million or whatever the money happened to be. And what's happened since then? There's been an NHL salary cap, and it's been pretty progressive and well-paying for everyone but the superstars of the NHL, who I think are terribly underpaid. But for the most part, there are guys making, you know, $5 million in today's NHL that would not be making that had it not been for Bob Goodenow pushing salaries up, and then eventually he had to cave and give in and resign. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, resigned because he had led the players astray. I don't know if saying he completely misled them, but what he intended to do and what he wound up doing were two completely different things. And the players, you talk to any player who lost that season, that's money you never get back. That just doesn't come back.
Phil Kessel this week set the NHL Ironman record, playing in his 990th consecutive game. Rather than quote from your original column on Kessel, which you should get the book and read it, here's the update in the book you wrote specifically for the book. When this piece originally appeared, it created huge controversy. The lead about a hot dog vendor was inaccurately written with the wrong address. It has been corrected here. Then you say, I stand by the facts of this piece. So 7 years later, what are your 2022 thoughts about the column and about Phil Kessel?
I believe that piece, if you want to know why Phil Kessel is not a Maple Leaf anymore or wasn't a Maple Leaf from that year on, you read that story because it will tell you why. And I'll explain it just a bit further. I wrote the piece, and the next day, Brendan Shanahan, president of the Leafs, goes into work, and there's a lot of people in his office kind of chuckling. And finally Shanahan turns around and says, like, what are you guys chuckling about? And he said, well, did you read, Steve's column today? And he said, no, I haven't had time yet. Why? He said, read it. It reads like you wrote it. And that's because over the course of a year or two, I had been gathering, reasons why the Leafs had it with Kessel, who was their leading scorer every year he played for them. So I'll give you an example. Mike Babcock gets hired to coach the Leafs. This is before they trade Phil to Pittsburgh. And in my first conversation with Babcock, after he gets hired, my first private conversation, you talk like I always talk to coaches and GMs as they're hired. How do you want to have the relationship? Do you want to text? Do you want to send emails? What works best for you? How are we going to sort of get to know each other better? And the first thing he says is, I don't go off the record. I never go off the record. So then we continue on with the conversation. And I said, do you want Phil Kessel on your team next year? And the first thing out of his mouth, let's go off the record. So, that gives you an indication of what Babcock thought of him, not independent of what Shanahan and the front office of the Leafs thought of him. What happened was, with about 40 games or so to go, I can't remember how many, Randy Carlyle got fired. And they brought in one of the assistant coaches to take over. And they basically, Shanahan said to the players, you have this part of the season to show me if you want to continue to be a Maple Leaf. Because they were going to be starting this franchise over and rebuilding from scratch. And so what happened was, from that moment to the end of the season, Kessel couldn't have played worse. It's the worst hockey. If you go look at a 40-year sample size, it's probably the worst hockey of his career. And certainly the worst hockey of his career once it hit maturity. And what it showed people at the time was, I don't give a whatever to be here. I don't care about this group or this team, and I don't care about you, Brendan. And so by the end of the year, Shanahan had it with him. Peter Horachek, the coach, had it with him. The assistant coaches had it with him. And Babcock, who was coming in to be the next head coach, by proxy, had it with him. And so, here we are. And this is an interesting week because Phil Kessel breaks the all-time record of most consecutive games played. And it's a fantastic record. And he's a terrific hockey player, talent-wise. but he's also, can be a difficult person or unusual person to have on your team and he's not a great guy to have as your best player. If you notice, the best hockey he ever played was in Pittsburgh when he was third or fourth best player on those Penguins teams. And so that's the best he's ever played. And when he was depended upon as the best player, he didn't really work out. So to go back to your original question, never mind the whole controversy that came of the hot dog. Hot dogs were 2 sentences in a 900-word piece that to this day, it's funny, they still do. He still does it. And you know what he's never done, by the way? He's never denied it. Not once. He's never once said, I don't eat hot dogs, or I didn't do that, or that was stupid. He's never said that. He's never contacted me. His agents never contacted me. A lot of press people were offended, more so than and fans were offended, more so than Phil, I believe, was. But if you want to know really why the Leafs decided at the end of that season to part ways, go back and find that story and read it, or read it in the book, because I have not seen a better analysis anywhere of what happened there.
A column that was much more consequential and very thoughtful, I thought, was about 2 pro athletes, Wade Belak, a seemingly happy-go-lucky NHLer, and Mike Flanagan, MLB pitcher and master of the snappy comeback. Both of those accomplished athletes committed suicide. And the line of yours that stuck with me, quote, really, we only thought we knew them.
Well, in the case of, I'll speak more in the case of Wade Belak, because in those days, every dressing room has what you'd call a class clown. He's the guy that will appear in any circumstance. He'll go on any video. If you want to do something for the local news that's not, the usual hockey, Wade Belak will do it. If there was something City TV needed to be done, he would do it. He was the smiling, happiest, go lucky, friendliest player in the Maple Leaf dressing room. And one of, at that point in time, really one of the least skilled players as well. He was a fighter, like we had mentioned fighters from previous. But what happened is he killed himself. And why? You never know exactly why someone kills themselves, and you can't pretend to know. But what happens in a situation like that is you realize, and I've had this happen not just from suicides, but certainly from other circumstances, is you can think you know someone. You can be in there every day interviewing them. You can be around the dressing room. All you know is the dressing room person, the person who puts on his face, his bold face, whatever it happens to be in that room that day. But you don't know what's in his mind. You don't know if he's in pain or he's not in pain. You don't know if he's suffering from depression or any other form of mental illness. And so what prompted me on that was, here was the most outgoing Maple Leaf, which I later found out was actually not unusual for people who commit suicide. Here was the most outgoing Maple Leaf who was now retired and about to become a broadcaster, and he killed himself in downtown Toronto. And to this day, of course, we're confused by how it happened and why it happened and all the circumstances that go along with it. But it tells you. And my friend Stephen Brunt, who's one of the great Canadian sports writers of the last many decades, would often say, we think we know them, but we never really do. And this was a case where, for me, that just stood out.
Thank you for that. Let's finish with the story that you also chose to finish the book. It's titled, "And Don't Forget the Snacks." You commented about that column. Of all the columns I've written over the years, none hit a nerve in a positive way the way this one did, and I didn't see that coming. Tell us, please, how you came to write "And Don't Forget the Snacks."
Well, first off, if you Google my name today and the words apple juice, I think you'll get more than 1 million responses. That's how widely distributed this column has been. I coached minor hockey for a long time. I coached both of my kids from almost the time they started to the time they finished. So I put in about 26 seasons of coaching minor hockey with my kids, and then after my kids had moved on. This was one of the early years, and I was coaching a house league team, and if we win the game that Saturday afternoon, we're going to go play in the finals the next day. And there's about a minute to go, and we're up by a goal, and I'm hyper focused on the ice, watching the last minute of play, and I get a tug on my jacket. I look down, and there's one of my players. Coach, are there snacks today? A minute to go. We need to win. You're going to play tomorrow. And then I look down. He says, I hope it's not apple juice. I don't like apple juice. At that moment, it hits you that, boy, the kids sure see the game differently than you do. You being the coach, the parents being the parents, kids really have a different perspective and a different view. And I used to see it also when we would go to restaurants after tournaments or games as a group, and the parents would sit at one table talking about what went on in the game, and the kids would be talking about Nintendo or their toy trucks or whatever it was they were talking about. They had no interest in talking about a 4-3 loss or a 4-3 win or what happened in the game or anything else. And all the parents were doing was dissecting every moment of the game. So that same day, by the way, I get a phone call from the goalie's father. And these kids are, I think, 6 or 7. And he phones me and he says, Jeremy can't play tomorrow. Tomorrow was the championship. And I said, oh, why is that? He said, he told me he doesn't want to. And I said, do you mind if I talk to him? And he said, sure. And he didn't know why. He puts Jeremy on the phone. And I said, Jeremy, do you trust me? Jeremy said, yeah. I said, can you tell me why you don't want to play tomorrow? And he said, after a long pause and nothing being spoken, he says, they hurt me. I said, what do you mean they hurt you? He said, after the game, everybody jumped on me and it scared me. And so whatever it was, whether it was all the players piled on him or whether somebody need him somewhere or whatever it was, that group at that moment had all jumped on the goalie, which they've seen on TV how many times before. And the little guy at the bottom of the pile wasn't very happy about it. And I said, Jeremy, if I promise you tomorrow, if we win, that the only thing that players will do is take their stick and tap your pads, will you be okay with that? And he said, yeah. I said, does this mean you'll play? And he said, yeah. And he showed up the next day and he played and we won the championship and then nobody jumped on him. But what you realize in those moments, and I realized it from so many years of doing it, is we have to listen to our kids. Especially as coaches, we have to listen to our kids and we have to listen to what's important and what matters to them. And the thing about the snacks, it's not that it was apple juice or not apple juice or chocolate bars and not chocolate bars. It was the routine. This is what the routine is. We play hockey, then we have snacks. And you realized how important that routine was to the 6 and 7-year-olds and how you couldn't break it. And to this boy at that moment in time, the win meant nothing, but the post-game snack meant something. And that never left me. And that piece has been in USA Hockey that's gone to like every minor hockey organization almost in America. It's been reprinted. It's been in programs. It's been in other places. I tried to get Hockey Canada, God bless them, to do the same years ago. And they weren't as interested as USA Hockey, which I didn't search out. They searched out me on it. And it got into Europe and it got into other places. And that's why I wanted to finish the book with it, because it's meant so much to me over the years. And I think kids sport, and in particular kids hockey, which gets bashed far too much in this country, is one of the great experiences of my life, my children's lives, and my family's life. And we have made more friends and developed more relationships and got to know more people because we were involved in minor hockey and in minor sports than anything else we've done in our lives. And that's why it mattered so much to me then when I wrote it, and all these years later, it matters so much to me now.
Well, you know, Steve, Hockey Canada doesn't always make good choices.
Yeah, there was a different group, I think, than the ones in charge now, or although I don't know who's in charge now. But that said, you know, to me, the piece stands on its own, and again, as it has for all of these. You know, my son who was on that team is 32 now, so that tells you how many years ago this was written. But
just as relevant.
Just as relevant, and I'm thrilled to have done it. And I wrote a bunch of other pieces about coaching minor hockey over the years that, you know, there was no spot for it in the book. Obviously, I wanted to pick just one piece, but all of those kind of pieces got phenomenal response because it's one of those push button subjects.
Yeah.
That there are so many people involved, and it hits home for so many people. And the one, you know, every mom who's ever been a soccer mom, or, you know, baseball in the summer or softball or whatever team sport they were playing, you know, hockey or basketball or whatever, they were cutting up the oranges or doing what it is they're doing, you know, can relate to the circumstance of let's make sure our snacks are there.
Great stuff. Was it apple juice for snack?
Yeah. I don't believe it was actually, but I wish I had because he didn't want it to be apple juice, but I don't recall. Apple juice seemed in those days to be the convenient one because you could go to the grocery store and get the juice boxes, and you know, they were easy to distribute and clean up after and that kind of thing. I think they were easier than anything else, so they probably showed up more often, and much to the dismay of my young fellow who didn't care for them.
The name of the book is A Lucky Life. I've lost track. Is this 23 or 24 books now?
It's actually a lot less than that. I think this is the 10th.
Oh.
And of those 10, some of them are just books I contributed to, like wrote a chapter for, part of. I think for me personally, I think it's 4. The Lanny McDonald book was the first one. I wrote a book on the Calgary Flames before leaving Calgary, and I wrote The Lost Dream, which is the story of Mike Danton and David Frost and that horrible circumstance that took place over the years, which actually involved Sheldon Keefe, who's now the coach of the Leafs, and he's mentioned in the book as his story, and so. I'm particularly proud of this. When you do what I do and you do it the way I do it, you get a lot of grief for saying this about that person or that about this person. And when you write the Sunday Notes column I write, people love it, but you also get grief when someone disagrees with your viewpoint. I think what this book almost shows another side of my career, another side of me. It displays the storytelling, story crafting side more than anything else, and I'm extremely proud of the collection here, and the fact that, you know, there's a lot. I don't know if you know the movie The Big Chill.
Yes, of course. It starts with a guy in a casket.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies, and Jeff Goldblum plays the part of a writer for People magazine in the movie. And they asked Jeff Goldblum at the time, like, how long are your pieces? And he says, well, I was told to write a piece as long as it takes the average person to go to the washroom. And so, you know, and that's what I've kind of planned on here, you know.
Except when Muhammad Ali died.
Okay, so you got to have, maybe that's a day where you're struggling, you know. But you know, you could put this book if you're a sports fan, you put this book in your washroom and you open it to any page, because it doesn't have to be read in any order. It doesn't go necessarily in any particular order, except it's grouped into sports. And I love the fact that there's a combination of CFL and NFL in there, and that there's a lot of Blue Jays content and a lot of basketball Raptors content, and obviously it's about 60% hockey because that's been so much of what my professional life has been. But there's also a lot of boxing in there. So the things that I've covered the most of and enjoyed the most, check up the book. And I think
when and where can people get it?
Well, right now online, whether it be Amazon or Chapters Indigo or any of the online places you buy books. And as of the first week of November, it will be, as they say, in Canada, I believe, in better bookstores everywhere.
Well, as someone who has read the book front to back, we've only scratched the surface. There's much, much, much more to enjoy from A Lucky Life. And Steve, thank you so much for being generous with your time and spinning some tales with us. We've enjoyed it immensely.
I'm glad you did. I like listening to your show whenever it's on.
Well, there's no accounting for taste. But thanks anyway. Good night for Hockey Time Machine.
Good night.